I'd like to welcome Dr. Jeff Crisp from UNHCR to the podium for the last time. We were delighted when Jeff agreed to come to Australia to speak at this conference. It's clear he's had no free lunch. We've worked him incredibly hard and have had the opportunity to hear from him on many critically important subjects of great concern to all of us. So, Jeff, again, I'd like to extend my thanks to you and invite you to address your closing remarks. Thank you.
For those of you who were here last night, I'm going to begin by reassuring you I'm not going to use any rude words in my presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of UNHCR headquarters, I'd like to thank the University of New South Wales, the Centre for Refugee Research, and the UNHCR regional office in Canberra for organising this very stimulating conference. I think the timing of the conference could not have been any better, coming as it does just before UNHCR Standing Committee next week, followed by our NGO consultations meeting. The conference also comes at a critical moment in the troubled history of Australian refugee and asylum policy. This morning I had the great pleasure to be at an Australia for UNHCR breakfast, which was attended by the Governor-General, a variety of well-known Australian personalities, high-level business people, men and women of refugee background, and a number of school children. And I only wish that the politicians who are currently squabbling over the treatment of a few thousand boat arrivals, in fact, less than 1/70th of the refugees currently accommodated by Kenya, could have been at that breakfast this morning. Because they would have seen a diverse community of people, all of them devoted to the protection of refugees, to the work of UNHCR, and to the defence of Australia's humanitarian reputation. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been kind enough to invite me onto the podium 3 times in the course of this conference, and so I'm sure you're getting sick of the sight of me, which gives me an excuse to keep my concluding comments very brief. I think what we've seen over the last few days is the way in which 3 A's can come together in a very effective and powerful manner. A for analysis, A for advocacy, and A for action. I think if we are to address the world's refugee and displacement problems in a more concerted and coherent manner, then we must combine these 3 activities, analysis, advocacy, and action, in exactly the way that this conference has been able to do so successfully. This combination of activities, analysis, advocacy, and action is also the combination of activities that we try to combine in the section of UNHCR for which I'm responsible, and therefore I'm particularly supportive of the approach taken by this conference, which has brought together academics, practitioners, policymakers, people of refugee background, in a discourse that has been designed to formulate a series of very concrete and action-oriented recommendations. And while I know that you'll be taking these recommendations forward yourselves, both here in Australia but also in Geneva in the next few weeks, I can also promise to feed those recommendations into the policy-making process at UNHCR headquarters. To be honest, we need all of the good ideas we can get. I can also promise to draw the High Commissioner's personal attention to the plenary statement that is being formulated. And I can assure you that Mr. Guterres takes the voice of civil society extremely seriously, and I will draw it to his attention. Ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned last night in my conversation with Jane McAdam, we are still not yet halfway through 2011, and yet we have already been confronted with a series of humanitarian crises. Hundreds of thousands of people displaced in and from the Ivory Coast, a similarly large number of people forced to flee Libya, a good proportion of them people who are in need of international protection. And now the emerging refugee crisis on the border of Syria and Turkey, a crisis that seems much more likely to escalate than to come to a quick conclusion. Who knows what other refugee crises may take place in the remaining months of the year, a year in which we are, of course, commemorating the 60th anniversary of the UN Refugee Convention. At a time when so many politicians in so many parts of the world are questioning the obligation to admit refugees and asylum seekers onto their territory, and are in some cases casting doubt upon the continued relevance of the Refugee Convention, I think we need to restate time and time again that this international instrument has helped to save millions of lives, giving those people the opportunity to enjoy a more peaceful and productive life than was possible in their own country. Something that we haven't mentioned, I don't think, in the course of this conference, but another cause for celebration, is the fact that the African Union has also recently introduced a binding convention relating to the protection of internally displaced people. And I think that in this respect, one of the poorest parts of the world has set an important example to the rest of the international community. At the same time, and as we were reminded earlier in the conference by a person of refugee background, I think as well as responding to refugee movements, we must also make a concerted effort to stop the armed conflicts, the violence, and the human rights violations that oblige people to flee from their own country in the first place. Not only is one refugee without hope too many, one refugee is too many. So let us go away from this conference and try to work together to create a world in which no one is obliged to seek the protection of the 1951 Refugee Convention. Thank you very much. I should just add that I get the impression that at least half of the people in this room are going to be in Geneva next week. So I look forward to seeing you shortly, and please pop by my office and have a drink with me. Thank you.
I hope you've got enough bottles of wine in there, Jeff. Jeff, thank you very much. Again, we deeply appreciate your being here, and certainly, most particularly, your commitment to take forward the recommendations and most particularly to take the statement from the conference to the High Commissioner. Many thanks. I'd now like to invite Paul Power from Refugee Council. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a real privilege to speak at the end of this conference that many of us have been involved in thinking about and organising for quite some time. And it certainly has exceeded my expectations, which were quite high expectations of the sort of dialogue and issues that it would cover. It's been a fantastic opportunity. And at this stage, I have to say that I'm underprepared for my remarks because I've basically been so heavily involved in taking in what's in the conference that I thought, you know, as the conference pans out, I'll develop some reflections. But there's just been so much happening that I think all of us will probably take a little time to go away and think through the implications of what we've heard in the last few days. But I'll give you some random reflections, and they're not in any particular order, or they're not necessarily, may not necessarily be my highest priorities when I think about it over a longer period of time, but certainly things that are foremost in my thinking at the moment. The first, over the past 4 days, we've heard again and again about the absolutely vital role of refugee leaders in a whole lot of different situations. We've heard about the role of refugee leadership in protracted situations, particularly on the Thai-Burma border and in India. We've seen a fantastic example of the organised national refugee leadership that exists within New Zealand and the role that they play in influencing national policy on refugee settlement and refugee issues. And we've seen so many fantastic examples of people who've experienced refugee flight themselves, who are working in fundamentally critical roles within Australian asylum seeker and refugee support. I was very much struck by Jeff's reflections a couple of days ago on the changes that he's seeing, you know, looking at the big picture, and I've joked that I'll pinch quite a few of his ideas, but I actually will credit you whenever, well, when it suits me, I'll credit you anyway. But you know, I found his analysis really, really fundamentally important, and particularly his emphasis on the fact that refugees are finding their own survival strategies and that the situation is rapidly changing. You know, that what existed 10 years ago doesn't exist anymore. And I think, you know, that's important not only from an international perspective but from a national perspective. You know, if we have politicians who think that, you know, stopping the boats can be achieved by sending people, you know, as occurred in 2001, 2002 to Nauru, I think they'll actually, if they actually ever, God forbid, get around to implementing that policy, I think they're going to get a rude shock. You know, things have moved on. You know, the world is a different place to what it was, and you know, not only will they be damaging, you know, people in the way that occurred in the past, but also, you know, yeah, so much has changed since then that there actually is no, you know, magic anecdote for the problems of people movement. But also, yeah, I was struck by the fact that you emphasise that people are finding their own solutions because of the failure of international durable solutions. And I think that gives us a lot of cause for reflection about what we're seeing. A third area of, you know, that I've been thinking about has been the research released by the International Detention Coalition, both internationally and released formally nationally last week. And I think when you look at what the International Detention Coalition is finding, as an Australian, I'm struck by how extraordinary and also how unacceptable Australia's approach is of detaining on a mandatory basis asylum seekers who enter the country without a visa. And, you know, it was, well, last week I actually had the opportunity to participate in a UNHCR convened dialogue involving government, NGO and UNHCR on alternatives to detention. And through that, learnt more about the policies in the UK, New Zealand, the United States, and a number of European countries. And what I wasn't quite clear about, but I am much clearer about now, is that the UK, which receives close to 20,000 asylum seekers each year, would not detain the people that Australia is detaining. That the majority of asylum seekers in the UK don't have visas at the time that the UK Border Agency finds them. So they are, you know, irregular or whatever, you know, term you want to put on them. But despite the fact that there is so much political angst within the UK about people who, you know, who don't have a right to be within the country in terms of in formal legal settings, when the UK government finds asylum seekers, their default position is to give them some temporary status and to actually take their asylum claim seriously. Now, I know from our counterparts in the UK that there are issues within the UK asylum system, but, you know, the default policy of the UK, as tough as it is entirely different to Australia's policy. And we've actually seen some significant detention reform in Australia in the last couple of years with non-asylum seekers. In fact, the number of non-asylum seekers in detention is very, very low, and the new directions in detention policy is largely being implemented. And you know, the compliance people in DIAC have actually been making some significant shifts in the way that they treat people. Why can't it be applied to people seeking asylum? Why can't the Australian government find it in its heart, find the political will to say, fine, we detain people mandatorily, but we only do it for the purposes, you know, of identity, health and security checks. Not full ASIO security clearances, but just to assure ourselves that there is no risk with a person living in the community while their long-term status is detained. You know, from my point of view and from the Refugee Council point of view, if the government wants to maintain, you know, some semblance of a policy of mandatory detention, this may be heresy to some people, fine, but it should be very much time limited, very specific, and only to address, you know, the fear that some people have that a person who arrives without warning may pose some threat. Because of the 6,400 or so asylum seekers currently in detention centres, most of them detained for more than 6 months, most of them having not even completed the first stage of their refugee determination process. I mean, that's something which actually isn't properly unpacked. The vast majority of asylum seekers in detention haven't even completed the first stage of their detention process. You look at the department's own statistics and you'll see that. You know, but if those 6,400 people had a risk analysis applied, you know, as to whether or not they would pose a risk, everyone here knows that virtually none of them would be detained any longer than the risk analysis took to complete. So it's a critically important issue that we've got to take forward. The Malaysia deal, you know, what can you say? It's just a complete and absolute mess, and you know, and it just shows how twisted, you know, the political debate has become in Australia. That you that some good people, including some good people in government, think this is actually a viable alternative because of just this complete and utter national obsession with stopping people entering Australia by boat to seek asylum. So it must be opposed in every way it can be, but also we have to face the unfortunate reality that the Gillard government will do everything it can to make sure it happens. So we've also got to work out how to respond in that situation. One of the other things that came through pretty strongly was the prevalence of sexual and gender-based violence, throughout the whole process of seeking protection, prior to resettlement and after resettlement as well. We heard about the many protection challenges that women who've been resettled in Australia and elsewhere face after the protection provided for resettlement. And I think that there are so many issues that give us a cause for serious consideration about how genuine protection can be expanded. We also had some wonderful personal accounts of experiences of flight, of transition to life in Australia and contribution to Australia after arrival. On Wednesday night we had a forum here with 5 refugees who'd arrived over the past 60 years who talked about their own story. And it was a heartwarming occasion. It was a privilege to actually hear the stories. And we've had a number of opportunities, including at a plenary here yesterday, to hear other stories from people speaking quite personally about how they fled and what that the opportunity for a new life in a new land has meant. And we also had Graham Hugo's research released today, which was really unfortunate that the whole circumstances of the research being released, in a highly charged political environment, and also without, in a situation where there was some pretty unhelpful behaviour going on in the room. But that research is really, really significant because it's actually the first significant research looking at the longer-term contributions of refugee and humanitarian entrants in Australia. And I think, in the lunchtime session which I chaired, Graham Hugo, in a way, summarised his research in one sentence. He said, what the research shows is that people with get up and go, people with get up and go are the people who get up and go. So, in fact, and sort of one of my observations of the research is it actually shows that part of the transition to life in Australia over a number of generations is actually to reduce your educational expectations because the third and later generations Australians actually are less likely to study at a tertiary level than migrants and their children. When thinking about reasons for despair, there are many, and people sometimes ask me how do being the Refugee Council and hearing all these issues from members and how we keep going. And I'd say only half jokingly that I try not to analyse too deeply because you become quite despairing. But I see that there are many reasons for hope, and the reasons for hope come from people who are seeking asylum, people who've resettled, people who understand what life is like as a refugee, and many people like myself who haven't gone through that experience, who care and are prepared to stick their necks out, as unpopular as it often is. So, I think at times we can focus on the fact that there are at any one time tens of thousands of deeply sad people blogging bile on websites. But ultimately, they're a pretty small minority, and there are many more people who care, and there are also many more people who actually don't understand the issues and actually haven't been properly exposed to them. So in terms of what we can do, I just wanted to nominate a couple of things, and they're probably fairly obvious things. But one is that I think it's important that we don't marginalise our concerns for refugees by being drawn into this debate about whether or not refugee concerns are left or right. I always bristle, as my colleagues know, whenever anyone talks about refugee issues as being a progressive or a left issue. Well, I'm probably not all that progressive and probably not all that left. And when I looked in the, I suppose I am to some extent, but certainly not as left as some who visited us today. Yes, anyway, I was reflecting on the fact that the first 300,000 refugees who came after the war actually came to escape communism. But anyway, it's the Catholic in me that brought that one out. but it's interesting that in the individual membership of the Refugee Council, we have two former parliamentary leaders of political parties, and both of them Liberal, John Dowd and Malcolm Fraser. We have a whole collection of, we don't actually have any former leaders of the Parliamentary Labor Party. We have a former leader of the Parliamentary Democrats, Andrew Bartlett, amongst our individual membership as well. But this idea that that refugee concerns can be lined up with a whole lot of other causes that are popular in inner city Green voting electorates, it's just not. It's something that we've actually got to resist at every opportunity, because it actually undermines national support for refugee protection. The second is that every organisation, and I'm saying this particularly to myself and to our organisation as well as others here, that we've got to take every opportunity to promote and support the voice of asylum seekers and refugees in everything that we do. And from that perspective, I know there's much more that we as a Refugee Council can do, and we're certainly discussing internally how we can improve. But I mean, I've been really pleased to be able to participate with the Centre for Refugee Research in promoting and supporting the role of refugee community representatives, through the Geneva process. And what we've actually found is the more that we've done that, and the better organised that we've been, and the more support that we've been able to offer people who have been refugees to speak up, the more we're actually listened to in terms of the concerns that we take in Geneva. Last year we had some fantastic feedback from very senior UNHCR people saying, we actually do get the opportunity to talk to refugees in the field, but not in Geneva. We actually don't get refugee leaders coming to us at our headquarters putting forward issues of concern. So it's really important that we take every opportunity we can to promote and support the voice of people who actually understand personally what refugee flight is all about. A third is it's really important that we exercise our rights as citizens and speak up. And, I think many of us sort of feel great despair. You see the fact that the two major political parties are heading, in the opposite direction from refugee protection. And, I think it gives us reason to think that we should give up. But I think, if you look at those of us who know Freddie Steen in Brisbane, know what a great role model she is of just, of plugging away. In many ways, despite all of the evidence to the contrary, but she's actually, through her advocacy, has been able to manage to build up, some quite surprising supporters. And in fact, the Courier Mail in Brisbane is actually now one of the more refugee-friendly newspapers in Australia, which, 2 years ago was unthinkable, because she's actually been working consistently on a number of key people in that organisation. But I think it's also important that we know that the people who are madly blogging about refugee issues and just spewing bile, they're actually contacting their MPs and putting their concerns forward, and it's really important that we do the same in every opportunity. And the fourth thing is I think we need to participate in networks and support them in any way that we can. I gather in a couple of the sessions that I wasn't there was questions about what the Refugee Council and the Settlement Council are doing and shouldn't they be doing more. Well, look, yeah, we actually need your support to do more. We need people, who are members of we need people to join the Refugee Council and also the Settlement Council if you're involved in settlement services, because the person who was criticising his organisation isn't a member of the Refugee Council. I'm happy to receive a membership application. But it's important that you support these national networks and you actually demand more of us, we actually need to be pushed harder and further on key issues if you feel that we're actually not doing the right thing in representing the views of organisations and Australians who care about refugee issues. And also, we're keen to build a stronger network of people who actually want to write and lobby politicians, and we'd be really keen to hear from people, who are involved in that work and can encourage their friends. Because I think, as I say, the importance of each of us in our own capacity as a citizen and as a voter is something that we actually don't take seriously enough. If you think I'm just an ordinary citizen, it's really up to the Refugee Council or Amnesty International to speak out. to some extent, you know, the national bodies who have that role, they're regarded as the usual suspects. You know, Amnesty International would say that, the Refugee Council would say that. But if you're actually writing to your local, you know, arch-conservative MP or whatever, or your senators in your state, they're actually hearing from voters, they're hearing different perspectives to the ones that they're hearing all the time. So with those random thoughts and suggestions, I'll hand over to Linda. Thank you.
Paul, thank you. See, you really are a subversive in a suit. Lots of great advocacy in there. I also just wanted to say on behalf of the Centre for Refugee Research, it has been and is an enormous pleasure to have the close working relationship we do with Refugee Council of Australia. It's a valued relationship. I think it's an incredibly productive one. And to particularly appreciate you and Lucy for the incredible amount of work you put into this conference and Lucy's efforts in supporting the women's dialogues as well. And I assure you, Paul is one of the fiercest advocates I know for community representation. So there have been many occasions where Paul has put himself on the line to ensure that if there's an opportunity for someone to speak, that it's a former refugee rather than one of us white fellas. And that advocacy, I think, I've appreciated and many of the communities have as well. So thank you again, Paul. It's my pleasure now to pass to our last speaker of the conference, a friend, a colleague, Cherry Zhao, someone who works tirelessly for the rights of women, men, children, families among the Chin refugee community inside Burma, in India, in Mizoram, which is on the border with India and Burma, in New Delhi, where many refugees from her community live in appalling conditions, facing terrible risks every day. Cherry herself and her family have and continue to face many of those risks. So to pick up Pamela Kerr's point that she made earlier, most of us here will return home in safety tonight and tomorrow and next week. Most of us never have and will never face the kind of risks that Cherry and many others of you who are activists, refugee and civil society activists in countries around the globe and in the region, where every single day, as a result of the work that you do, you put yourselves, your families and your communities at risk. And I'd just like to ask us all to kind of take a moment to acknowledge and mark the incredible courage of many of those of you, the refugees who are here, the civil society activists, and to thank you for your ongoing efforts for the rights of refugees. So thank you. So Cherry, please.
Thank you, Linda, for the kind words. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. As standing here, I remember millions of refugees around the world who are stuck in refugee camps or in urban areas without any papers, without any documents to be able to travel here. Remembering them, I would like to speak on behalf of them today. And before I deliver my message to 4 entities or institutions, I would like to say a big thanks to the University of New South Wales, members of Centre for Refugee Research, and all the interns up there, and all the organizations who are organizing this amazing conference. Thank you to them. I noticed that there is a significant thing about this conference because I've seen a lot of people from refugee communities, representatives, and civil society representatives. Often we have conference without reflecting the real voices of the people who know the situations, who face the challenges on the ground. So this is very significant. And then again, I express my gratitude for organizing this conference. The gentlemen in front of me have already emphasized a lot of things that we have been discussed in the past 4 days. So I will not go on to those details. I just have 4 messages to the 4 important institutions or entities that affects our life. One is the authoritarian regimes around the world. You have to stop killing people. You have to stop oppressing people. You have to stop harassing us. We are tired of running. We're tired of living with fear. We're tired of hiding. We want to have a place that we call home. A friend here today, she asked me, "You don't have a title?" Yes, I don't have a title because I'm not a citizen of my own country yet, but one day I will be returning to Burma. So that's the message to the authoritarian regimes around the world. And those governments and business sectors who are supporting those regimes, you have to stop. Because at the end of the day, we become the burdens of your country. You gotta stop working with them, supporting them, financing them. That's my message. The second message is UNHCR. Jeff, you talked about the policy, and you're going, I trust you're going to take all of these recommendations into the head of the UNHCR office in Geneva. Every single policy you made, every actions UNHCR office take on the ground, remember our faces, remember our voices, because those actions and policy affect our daily lives and our survival. My message to the governments who are funding the works of UNHCR, the works of civil society groups, the works of INGOs, the works of national NGOs, be generous to them, be generous to us. We are not the victims of oppression forever. We are also contributing to the world, to be a better place, to be a more peaceful place, and to be more prosperous. We can contribute too. The last message is the international advocacy groups, campaign groups, including the organization like Center for Refugee Research. Please continue to be the voice of those who are being silent, of those who cannot speak for themselves at the moment. Thank you.